Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first talk of our Spring 2022 Cofrin Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment seminar series. I want to welcome everyone who's part of our CLC family at KU, as well as extending a special welcome to people from other departments and centers at the University of Kansas, and also everyone who's joining us from outside of the university at other universities and organizations. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to tell you a little bit about how the webinar will work. Dr. Zapolski, as you see, will be presenting her slides on the screen, and she'll have video and voice capability. A selection of attendees, mostly from KU, have been promoted to panelists and have the option of turning on the video feed. Everyone else is an attendee and will not have access to video. We ask that everyone who is with us today keep your microphones on mute unless we are asking questions at the end. On that note, we will have opportunity at the end to ask some questions of Dr. Zapolski. It will be moderated by me. So if you have questions, you can submit them directly to me in the chat or in the Q&A window at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll moderate those. And depending on time, we likely may not have time to get to all of the questions, but we'll try our best. I do want to thank Sergey, Archana, and Drew here at KU for their coordination and logistical support of this seminar series. We're really excited that we're still able to offer these on Zoom so that we can have attendees from all over the country and even some people from outside of the US joining us. We do have an exciting calendar of seminars planned for the rest of the semester. We have 2 more coming. So I'll ask Sergey at some point to put the link to our events page. You can find the Zoom links there to register for the webinars, just like you did for this one. And we also have a Twitter page for our center, and we'll put that link in as well so you can follow us for all of the updates associated with our center. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tamika Zapolski. And this is I was just telling her it's exciting for me because it feels a little bit like full circle because I actually did my first summer research position at the Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis way back when I was an undergrad. So this feels a little bit nice to have some IU roots back here with us today. So Dr. Zapolski is an associate professor of clinical psychology at Indiana University-Purdue University at Indianapolis. And she's also part of the Indiana University School of Medicine. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kentucky and also did her clinical internship at the UK Medical Center. She's the director of the Prevention Research in Substance Use and Minority Health, the PRISM lab at IUPUI. Her research focuses on risk for substance use and other health behaviors among African Americans, with a specific emphasis on understanding risk models for alcohol and cannabis use. And she has a theoretical model that is examining interactions between cultural variables and environmental factors to better understand substance use among African American youth and young adults. She has a very impressive career. She's supported by a K01 training grant from NIDA and is co-director of the Adolescent Behavioral Health Research Program at IU. And other awards, of which she's had many, include, just a sampling, include Learning for Early Careers in Addiction and Diversity, the LEAD program. She's a scholar with them. She is a Health Disparities Course Scholar with the National Institute of Minority Health Disparities and is a National Diversity Scholars Network participant fellow for NIDA. Today, she will be discussing her research on understanding alcohol and other substance use among Black African Americans using a socio-ecological lens. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zapolski.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start my timer so I make sure I stay in 45 minutes. So yes, thank you so much for that introduction. So today I will be talking about alcohol and other substance use among Black Americans through a socio-ecological lens. First, I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest. And already discussed, I am the director of the PRISM lab, which focuses on 2 separate but complementary lines of research. The first is really trying to understand developmental risk for substance use during primarily adolescence and young adulthood. I do some work in children and some work in adults and older adults, but that kind of adolescence, young adulthood is the bread and butter of most of the work I do, and really trying to understand risk and protective factors through a socio-ecological cultural lens among minoritized populations. My presentation today will focus on Black Americans, but we also do work with multiracial, Hispanic, Latino. I also do work with sexual minorities and also intersectionality across different identities. And the second line is intervention. I really am interested in bringing the work that we do back to the people that are in need of those services and are people that that we work with. And so doing interventions that can be implemented in settings, particularly for youth, and making sure that we are able to increase access. So because of that, I work a lot with public schools with interventions for a lot with minoritized youth as well as juvenile justice. So for today, I had 3 learning objectives. The first was really to try to lay the land on current understanding of alcohol and other substance use among Black Americans, but primarily among youth and young adults. And then also learning, providing frameworks for understanding or conceptualizing substance use risk among Black Americans. And then lastly, providing some research that I've done, as well as some of my colleagues, on risk protective factors using that socio-ecological lens for Black youth for alcohol and other substance use. So I'm getting into the background. What we know across most substances is compared to white respondents, Black respondents tend to report lower levels of alcohol use and tobacco, and comparable or higher rates of marijuana use. And so looking at that from the 2019 NISDA data, you'll see that this is for 12 and older, that we have lower rates, pretty substantially lower rates of alcohol, slightly lower for tobacco, and then this case where we see comparable or again slightly higher rates of marijuana. If we're just looking at adolescents, same thing, where we see pretty substantially lower levels of alcohol use. And for adolescents, lower levels of tobacco, and then pretty comparable levels of cannabis or marijuana. And this you can also see we're looking at developmentally across age. The red line will be for African American or Black participants. The solid line at the top here is white. In the middle, we have Hispanic and Asian. And we see the same thing where African Americans have lower levels of use. You can also see that the peak is very different than what we think or usually see for white respondents for alcohol. And then what we see for smoking is not that peak still, but a gradual increase with marijuana over here with a circle, where we do see as we get into older age in this one, where we have that higher rate of marijuana use. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. And so with this marijuana, is one thing I want to point out here is that it used to be lower, as we saw in that graph where you can see with by age, but also just in time, that there was a time where marijuana or cannabis was pretty low among Black respondents or individuals compared to white youth and adults. And that gap has narrowed until 2013, where there was pretty consistent comparable or higher rates of marijuana use among Black youth. Now, interesting, when we think about all these different substances, and I guess there's different patterns of just use among Black youth and young adults compared to other groups, that when we look at problems, there's fairly consistent findings across all the substances that there are cases where there are higher rates of problems for Black Americans. So for alcohol, which is almost across the board, lower rates of alcohol use, as we saw. There's a higher likelihood of developing or dying from liver cirrhosis, alcohol-related mortality, alcohol-dependent symptoms, and a slew of social issues and legal issues from alcohol use. Cannabis use, again, a little different because we do see that there are higher rates more recently of cannabis use among African Americans, but there also has been findings of a higher risk of progression from use to disorder among Black youth and young adults, as well as even at comparable levels where we talk about the social implications. Black Americans are twice as likely to be arrested for using cannabis than white individuals. And then for tobacco, we also see, even though there's generally lower rates of tobacco use, that African American or Black Americans, although reporting fewer smoking cigarettes at a later age and smoking fewer cigarettes, are more likely to die from smoking-related diseases. And so there's this paradox, right, of generally we see lower rates of substance use, but we see this paradoxical finding of higher problems or risk of problems among Black Americans. And so I did a theory paper for alcohol specifically that was published in the Psychological Bulletin, looking at this of less drinking, but more problems, and pointed out that there are several cultural norms and environmental factors that can play a role in why there are more problems, particularly when we're thinking about interactions with family, problems with policing and legal issues that has less to do with how much you're using, but more about just the perception of risk, the norms around the use, and who around you are going to provide consequences. So if there's more policing in your neighborhood, it doesn't matter if you're drinking more or less than someone else. If there's more policing, you're more likely to probably get arrested for that. So some of that comes from that, but then there's also issues of maybe just the type of substances and the combination of substances might play a role in some of the things like liver cirrhosis or the more health complications related to engaging in substance use. And so we've done some work in our lab looking at that about, are there maybe certain differences in the combinations or type of substance use or the progression of use that might be related to some of these problems that have been reported among Black Americans. So the first was typology. I work a lot with youth, and many times youth, and as well as adults, don't just use one substance. So we, in substance use literature and research, we sometimes look at these in silos, but a lot of times people are using in conjunction with other substances at the same time. And so this was looking at typologies of use. And you can see that there is just different patterns of what type of substances are generally used together for African Americans, in this case, compared to white respondents. And so you can see here that there's this crossover when we get to the 2000s, where now there's higher risk of like cigarette and marijuana use than maybe so much alcohol marijuana use. And so is there possibly some difference in that combination that might be related to certain health outcomes? And so my graduate student and I looked at this specifically among youth, and we're looking at the National Study of Drug Use and Health data and looking to see, are there differences in combinations as well for youth using more recent data. So I think we used data from 2015, I believe. And so what we did find from this was that for the Black respondents in this data set, that there was higher odds of using alcohol and marijuana compared to white youth, as well as marijuana only. And so again, given that other study that found alcohol or marijuana and cigarette, and there is also studies looking at blunt use where a lot of, and this half actually is anecdotal with youth I work with here in Indianapolis, that a lot of them will say they use marijuana, sometimes exclusively, but it's really blunt use. So they're taking cigarillos or cigars, cigarettes, the lining of it, and then putting cannabis inside that and using that. And so there's this idea there might be difference, right, in the chemical composition of having those two substances together and using that could be also related to health outcomes, so which we don't always tease apart when we just ask them, have you smoked a cigarette? Are you engaged in cannabis use? But there might be certain combinations of that are not, that might be being missed in the way we assess those. So again, just showing that there are these different combinations of substances that are different, that are important to examine and explore. And the last thing here, just thinking about patterns of use, is specifically for alcohol, that we do see generally this lower rate of use of alcohol compared to other groups. And we don't see that steep peak that we find particularly for white individuals. But what we do see is that there is this point in like later age where the slopes are going down for the other groups, and they're either stabilizing or they're not flattening as much for African American or Black individuals. And so this was what was called the crossover effect, that there might be a point where lower risk individuals become higher risk as they age. And maybe there are some issues with maybe higher problems because of individuals using later on in their life or what's happening at that point. And so I did do some work in this area too. One, just a lit review of understanding this idea of a crossover effect. And so it was found in several studies dating back to the 1990s, as well in the 2000s, showing that there seems to be this indication for African Americans or Black individuals that although we generally think and find when we look at large data sets that African Americans are generally engaging in lower alcohol use, that this does seem to change when we start looking at older age. So Johnson found in 55, there was this crossover effect. Watts did a study and also seeing at 35. And then Yovan also found this at age 50. So again, outside of the young adulthood age, beginning to adulthood and later adulthood, seems to be a time where there might be higher rates of alcohol use among Black Americans. I also pulled up this study when I was thinking about this idea and trying to research this more. This was from the 1990s, but Barr did this really interesting study where it was looking at this idea of drinking, but not just alcohol use by race and gender, but also looking at differences based on income. And what they found was that the higher rates, higher rates of use were found at the lowest income bracket for Black Americans, as well as just average amount of drinking as mean number of drinks, average frequency and quantity. And so I combined these two ideas and to look at this crossover effect, saying, are there certain subgroups of Black Americans that might be at higher risk? It might be due to age, maybe something to also do with gender, but also possibly income. And can we look at these three together to see who may be the people that might be at the highest risk for engaging in alcohol use, particularly at older ages, using national data? And so I did this using the national 2010 to 2013 data from the National Study of Drug Use and Health, and found that this crossover effect was present, but it was only found for those in the lower income brackets. It was also found for both males and females. And so this again shows that if we consolidate just everyone together, that we lose a lot of the complexity and understanding what's going on, the nuanceness of this, that it's really important to understand the type of use people are engaging in, the combination of use, as well as these other demographic factors that could be playing a role, such as age, such as income levels, and not just controlling for it, but trying to stratify and look at these as meaningful variables. So that's all I have to say about just that first part, is understanding the landscape of substance use among Black Americans. So moving to the second learning objective that I had was understanding different risk models or theories for understanding substance use among Black Americans. And I want to start off with one that actually is not specific to Black Americans, but it was one of the earlier models that was really important of understanding the different factors that could be involved by Betrades from 1995 that said that, for substance use among youth, there's about 6 or 7 different domains that are important to consider. One being intrapersonal, so things inside a person, their self-esteem, impulsivity, personality factors. There's also attitudinal, how they view substance use. Religion was in here, school involvement, social importance, of course, parents, peers, are they using, what are their views about alcohol or other substances? And then Donovan expanded this to also include things such as community factors. So drug availability was in here, splitting parent and family and peer up into 2 separate factors. And what they also included here, the first one that I skipped over, was this demographic, that understanding that age, gender, race, ethnicity, income, right? The thing that I was saying before is important to include as actual variables of interest, as well as instead of just using them as covariates, are important because it helps us understand who may be at risk for engaging in substance use. And so using these different models, again, looking at these, what we think are universal factors related to substance use risk, there have been different studies that have used that and see, like, okay, do these models help explain those youth in particular that are going to engage in substance use. And so Vega did a study and looking at this for lifetime alcohol use and found that, it predicted well for some groups and not as well for others. So the lowest prediction for lifetime alcohol use based on these traits are these risk factors, which again fall in line with Donovan as well as Petraides, only accounted for about 34% of classifying accurately Black youth as lifetime alcohol users. And so here's another study that did a similar thing, but with binge drinking across domains. Now, I'll say most of them are not accounting for huge amounts of variance, but the lowest again in this one was for Black youth with about 10% of the variance in binge drinking. And so the thought is, okay, well, it's getting at some, but it's really missing a lot. And so what are some other variables that are not included in these theories and these models of youth substance use that would be really important, particularly for minority or African-American racial minority youth? And so I went through and started looking at some theories that really are about racial health disparities. And that's not for sure not exhaustive, but pulling some up, such as the cumulative disadvantage theory, thinking about early advantage disadvantage related to culture, how that can impact people's health over time. Minority stress model, which was originally for sexual orientation with health disparities, has also been used to understand other minoritized populations and really pointing to discrimination and victimization, as well as internalizing of those experiences on health outcomes. And then also this idea of the weathering effect, that just living in a racial conscious society and how that can just impact someone's health and well-being internally, as well as behaviorally, and can kind of work on deteriorating actually people's like immune functioning and telomeres, and there's things like internally that are impacted by this idea of the weathering hypothesis, but this also can relate to externalizing behaviors such as substance use. What I also liked was this idea of the socio-ecological model that in of itself does not include these like cultural variables, but does look at the interaction across different domains. Whereas like Donovan and Petraides were looking at these things and kind of siloed how they interact with each other. And so we have similar, the individual level traits. We have interpersonal. So we have the parent and peer influence. We have community, so access to resources, violence exposure, things in your neighborhood, and then societal, just like policies, different norms. But one thing that was missing from this that is included, right, in those other models that I just showed, such as the weathering effect and the minority stress, was culture. And so I took this model, which I really like for thinking about interactions across domains, with the idea that culture is also particularly important for Black Americans, of understanding racism and how that impacts an individual across these levels. So the minority stress model talks about internalizing it. So that's at the individual level, as well as interpersonal, of getting the interaction between different people based on race. It comes up in the societal level of norms and policies, whether or not they're policing your neighborhood or not, and just sociocultural, how people view your race as well as how you view it yourself. So understanding racism as a system and how it can impact all these different levels and how they interact with each other to impact health. And so I was really interested in using this framework with the work that I have been doing more recently. So I want to just point out moving now off of theory to looking at some of the work that I've done, some of the work my lab has done, and ongoing work that we're doing that's taking this framework as we think about Black Americans and risks for substance use. So this first one was a paper that I did with colleagues out of the University of Georgia, and it was called Why Now? Examining Antecedents for Substance Use Initiation Among African-American Adolescents. And so the point of this, the aim of the study was to really try to examine both these established cross-cultural factors. So thinking about Donovan, thinking about Petraides, say, hey, these are things that people say are important, right? And though we know does not explain everything. So can we include those in the model for initiation of substance use, but also examine culturally specific factors, in this case, racism or discrimination? Can we include that in and see, does that help explain or provide some additional variance in understanding risk for initiation for alcohol use, alcohol use, cigarette use, and marijuana use among Black Americans? And then also taking this developmental approach, seeing, is it possible that these things predict differently at different ages? So early adolescence for early initiators versus those during middle adolescence, when we generally think people start engaging in substance use, and then late adolescence, so 19 to 21. And so this study came from data that Dr. Jane Brody collected longitudinally over 14 years from different regions in rural Georgia, so around Athens, Georgia, and started in 2002 when youth were 11 years old. And there was about 500 African-American or Black youth that participated in this over 10 assessments. And so again, following along with what I showed before with Donovan and Petrades, we included measures that focused on the different domains. So we have family SES, so just like income in there. We have social risks. So this was that interpersonal, so parent-child conflict, parent support, peer substance use was in there. We also had attitudinal risks, so people's beliefs, views about alcohol, social engagement, religiosity was in there as well. And then intrapersonal, with things that within the person. So looking at depression, anxiety, anger, hostility is in there, externalizing behaviors. And then I also added, right, this cultural risk. So adding in racial discrimination or racism as an additional risk factor. And so the first aim was to look across, like everyone together, and just looking at initiation of cigarette, alcohol, and marijuana use. And what we found was that, let me put them all together, across the board, although we had some differences for gender and SES, racial discrimination predicted for each of the substances, was the only one that predicted for all three when we're thinking about those domains. We do think intrapersonal being important for cigarette initiation as well, but the discrimination was one that showed up, and which was wild also. I mean, that was one measure that we had in there. We had, latent variables and a lot of variables and for the other ones as well. But to show that this one predicted above and beyond all these other ones when everything was in the model, I think it's pretty great to show that. And then second, we want to look again developmentally to see who are there certain factors that are associated with initiation based on developmental periods. So early adolescence, mid-adolescence versus late adolescence. And what we found for early adolescent risk, that we have SES for for alcohol. And then for mid-adolescence, it was still SES. And then for late adolescence, SES popped up again. When I go to marijuana use for early adolescent risk, it was attitudinal factors. We had a lot that popped up for mid-adolescence. So it was gender, social factors, attitudinal, and racial discrimination for initiation of marijuana use during mid-adolescence. And then late adolescence, it was again, male, gender, and social factors. And then lastly, this was looking at cigarette use. We found several for early initiation, which was male, attitudinal, and intrapersonal. We found 2 being age and social for mid-adolescence, and then age and SES for late adolescent initiators for cigarette use. So that was a lot of data. I know I kind of roll through it quickly, but I want to kind of give you implications and what all that meant. So the first aim, which was hopefully easier to understand, it was just one slide, was of the 4 domains. Like I said, racial discrimination was the consistent predictor for initiating across all of adolescence among this group of 500 African-American rural youth. And so really this is one of the first, I would say, to show, does discrimination predict when you in models with what we consider cross-cultural, risk factors that we would assume would be, has been consistently shown to be predicting risk across, as long as we've been doing this. And so what it showed for me was that we really do need to focus on discrimination when we think about models for substance use, particularly for Black youth, and that these should be included in intervention programming. And Dr. Brody has already started this. So he has a strong African-American family teen program where discrimination is a core component. I'm actually doing some programming in schools right now, and also with just things that were changing over the last few years. We had one that was evidence-based, and we did a cultural adaptation to add in discrimination and bullying. And I would say that from my leaders that have been doing the group, that this youth are the most alive actually and interactive when we get to that part. And so really infusing it throughout the curriculum has been important to, one, be able to say like this is happening, but also provide resources and support on how to manage it and how to speak up if you see other people doing it, engaging in that behavior. So the second part, which might be a little, if you're following along, could seem a little confusing or contradictory, was that discrimination predicted all substances within the overall model, but only showed up for marijuana and mid-adolescence in the stratified model based on age. And so there's a reason we think this is. One, because, I think I'm moving over. One was because discrimination was actually only included during mid-adolescence. So for early adolescence, we actually didn't have a measure of discrimination. So it is possible, and when we look back at it, those that had the highest scores on discrimination were during mid-adolescence were early initiators. So what this is saying that we really need to understand exposure to discrimination as early as possible. I find in a lot of the work that I do that people start asking about racism discrimination during like late adolescence, high school age, or like young adult, but we don't ask kids about it. And I don't know if it's to protect them, but this might mean that they are experiencing it and they recognize it. And so if we can identify and understand what's happening and being able to provide additional support, that might be really important, particularly for Black youth, to decrease risk for substance use as well as other health outcomes. So let me back up for the other ones. So outside of that, we did find some other particularly developmentally anchored risk factors for substance use for Black youth. So for early adolescents, attitudinal risk factors predicted marijuana initiation, and both attitudinal and interpersonal predicted cigarette initiation. So maybe really focusing on their perceptions, how are they feeling, their views about substance use, right? Could be really important at that early stage. We think about that for Black youth. Middle adolescence, we had attitudinal also stepped in, or was shown. Social, racial discrimination we're predicting. And so we're kind of moving still attitudinal about how people are thinking about things, but also their environment. So really thinking about their social networks, about the discrimination and exposures they're experiencing during that middle adolescence might be a really important time to start hammering or really targeting those interventions that way to be able to reduce risk. And then when we got to late adolescence, social risk factors seem to stand out as predicting marijuana use. And again, showing that we think this idea of like as adolescents progress through their adolescent years, that the social and the interactions they have with others become really important in their peers. And so, as well as their family, I have some work looking at parent versus peer. And so really being able to focus on those environments and those networks when thinking about risk for substance use. So those are the takeaways that we had from that study, which I'm really proud of. And so just moving on to some additional work that I've engaged in the last 15 minutes I have. So I talked about, really this importance of racism and how to conceptualize it, as well as how it can be integrated in the work that you do, the work that researchers do to really understand how this the system impacts the health of, in the case of what I do, Black youth and young adults, but also thinking about how that impacts everyone. And where it starts to is understanding what racism is. And then hopefully I was able to articulate that well, but it's a system. It's not just someone does something to me and that impacts me, but it goes further. It's the structuring of opportunity and assigning value based on how someone looks. And this unfairly advantages some people in communities and unfairly disadvantages others, but it impacts everyone. And so in the idea of racism being a system, there's different levels of it. And so we can think about it from the highest level, so institutional and structural, so how goods and services are given to different people, thinking about neighborhood, redlining, how communities and schools are structured, what resources they have, and how that has a downward effect on people's well-being, substance use, and social interactions. We can then think about leveling down into personally mediated, which is where we usually think about racism or discrimination, where someone does something to me that you have an assumption about me based on my race, and that can relate to how you engage with me, you look at me in the eye or not look at me, what you say to me, right, based on race. And so this is differential action based on those assumptions. And so we do a lot of work with that idea of racism at that level, but another level within this person-mediated is microaggressions. And this is a nuance of racism that I have been spending a lot of time these last few years on, and really interesting work on racial microaggressions. So just to give you a little bit of definition about what this is, racial microaggressions are brief, everyday exchanges that send demeaning messages to a target group. They're often subtle, they're often indirect in nature, and they can manifest in many ways, verbally, nonverbal, visual, or behavioral. But and they're often automatic. The people that do them, and we all do them, we all engage in microaggressions, is automatic and generally unconscious, although it can be intentional, but in most cases they are unconscious and unintentional, which makes it difficult for the person, because you don't realize you're doing it, but also the other person being like, did they say that? I don't think they meant it. And you have to, they're just like catch-22. Do I say something to them? Do I not say it? Did I really hear that? And so it's hard on many levels, but it happens constantly, particularly for minoritized individuals. And you can think about this within those different theories. So like the weathering hypothesis of living constantly in that state. And these happen, we'll show in this video, happen multiple times a day for individuals, how that impacts one's health. So I'm going to play this video just to give you, if you're not aware this term or sometimes need concrete examples, going to watch this video on microaggressions.
Oh, you're so pretty for a Black girl. Oh, she has a Jew nose.
Oh, your hair would look so good if it was straight.
Jews are so cheap. Why are you so cheap?
Do you speak good English?
How are you an Iraqi Jew?
I think the person saying microaggression kind of doesn't really think about it.
This person who said it was my friend, and I was astonished that they would say something like that.
You don't want to make a big deal about it, but then it's also you just said something that offended me, so I feel like I should speak up.
Because they're micro, because they're very subtle, they're small, you feel like you don't have a reason to be upset. You're overreacting, and people even can make you feel that way when you bring it up. They're like, oh, you can't take a joke.
You're making too big of a deal of this. Why are you overreacting?
Don't take it so seriously. It was just a joke. Chill out. Say oh no, I actually love Black people. I love people of color. They try to just minimize the situation.
If someone feels hurt by a microaggression, it shouldn't just be pushed to the side.
It definitely has negative impacts and leads to people disliking who they actually are. Those kinds of subtle offensive comments can build up over time, and they can have a deep psychological effect, and they can make you feel bad, and they can make you doubt yourself.
We try to just use jokes to make things less awkward or ease social experiences, but it is important because you need to be aware of what you're saying and who you're speaking to.
Think of what you say and how it can affect the person you're saying it to.
So hopefully that was helpful to understand a little bit more about racial microaggressions if you're not aware of that. And really that last part, right, that it makes the person feel, the target of it, unwelcome, isolated, unsafe, alienated, and like one of the teens said, not liking who they are, which is just, really, really sad that that's the state people get to with these. And so we started working on this idea of, okay, similar to what I did with the Petrades and Donovan work with racial discrimination, this idea of racial microaggressions, if we include them with these other stressors, does it still, like on its own, you can say, like, yes, it's important, but does it still predict when we include them with models of other risk factors that we also know to be related to substance use and other like health outcomes? And so we did a study where we included, this is for young adults, but used trauma experiences, and also included racial microaggressions in the model. And this was for just Black young adults. And so what we found, first model was just with our covariates for age, gender, income, our recruitment source, as well as race, and that was multiracial versus monoracial. They're all Black young adults. And then we put trauma in, and we saw that that was a significant predictor of alcohol use. And then we added after that, we put in racial ethnic microaggressions, and we found that that predicted above and beyond trauma. Again, just showing that we know, like from these conversations that we have with people, that they are very impactful, but just showing statistically that research-wise, like, yes, this still is important. It also actually predicts above and beyond these other things that we already know are important risk factors for health outcomes. So did the same thing for cannabis use. And interestingly, for this one, trauma did not predict cannabis use among the Black young adults in our sample, but racial ethnic microaggressions did. So again, showing it's not accounting for as much variance as alcohol, but again, showing that it does predict, and it does predict above when all these other variables that we had were in the model. And so one last thing I just want to say that we have not gotten to another level of racism is vicarious racism. So this is the idea of seeing or hearing about racist events, experiences through media, through conversations with other people. And there's also evidence to show that just the knowing that it's happening, I guess also depending on how close that person is to you, also predicts health outcomes. So something we haven't gotten to yet, but one thing I always wanted to put in here is knowing that that also is important to explore within research. So just to get into some of the work that we're doing to look at this. So I have a study right now going on at IU where we're looking at stress and racial discrimination among Black teens. Actually, it goes now to age 19. We're trying to look at these different factors. So we have structural racism in there. We have the individual mediate racism. We have racial microaggressions. We also include a measure on vicarious racism. So to understanding how this impacts substance use and health, we're looking at depression, anxiety, just general distress, as well as how it gets underneath the skin. So as I was talking about before with the weathering effect, that these things, this living in this race-conscious society can do things internally to a person that they don't even realize. And so looking at inflammation markers, looking at stress hormones to see how these things are playing outside or impacting the body and how that might then impact people's health and behavioral experiences. And this is focused specifically on Black young people. So excited to get this data and see what's going on. But I would be remiss to stop there because it's true that all the stuff, I feel like sometimes these conversations and presentations like, oh, look at all the bad things that are happening for Black Americans. And it's true. And I acknowledge and say like, yeah, these things are happening, which is really important to recognize and have the data to support this and have this hopefully impact policy and interventions to help mitigate and reduce just exposure to discrimination. But also realizing that Black Americans are very resilient, that there are a lot of protective and promotive and factors that are already embedded within the community that can also be strengthened, that are helpful with reducing risk. I mean, when I first started, right, the first slide was that all this to say that yes, cannabis use is higher, but there's also generally lower rates of alcohol use and cigarette use. We look at some of the other health outcomes. Black Americans do very well. But again, there are sub-segments of the population that don't. It's important to understand, as well as just understanding that there are many positive factors and traits within the community. And so one that we have been looking at a lot is the idea of racial identity. Racial identity is how a person views themselves. So kind of opposite of the racial microaggressions of feeling less about yourself, internalizing some of that. Racial identity is generally that positive idea of like how closely do you align yourself with your race, the positive feelings you have about your race. And we find that those that have strong racial identity is associated with promotive effects on health and also mitigating the risk posed by racial discrimination and racism. But there are also differences how people fall on these racial identity, and it's very actually pretty complex construct. And so one of my graduate students, Rochelle Clifton, has been working on disaggregating this and looking at it within a profile framework. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the work we've been doing here using the multidimensional identity measure of Black identity. And so this looks at racial identity based on racial centrality, so how central it is to you, private regard, how do you feel yourself about your race, public regard, how do you feel others view your race, and then racial ideology, systemicist, humanist, oppressed, minority, and nationalist. And basically that's on a spectrum of thinking that, everyone's just human and we should just go that way to, that Black Americans are oppressed and they're unique, to this idea that there's many people that are oppressed and, one of them is just African Americans or Black individuals. So looking at these different profiles, there's 4 that came out, one being a race focus, which was primarily the majority of the people in our study, and this was Black young adults. And this is a group that was connected to the Black culture and aware of racism specific to Black Americans. The second was multiculturalists, they're aware of race and oppression more broadly, but also believe that others generally hold a positive view about Black Americans. Integrationists were people that were not really connected to the Black culture and really just kind of focused on shared human qualities, so weren't really focused on race itself. And then undifferentiated were individuals that didn't really hold a strong race view at all for themselves or for others. And what we found was that there were some promotive effects. So the multiculturalist was found to be actually across the board for us. For our study, the one that was the most positive for academic and depression, but actually interesting was a risk factor for cannabis use. And then undifferentiated was also a risk factor for academic motivation. We found also a moderating effect for substance use, where greater risk among the race-focused and undifferentiated, but lower risk among the integrationists and multiculturalists. So, there seems to be some cases where, and this is actually an interesting finding with this, that there's some cases where your racial identity might be protective, other times where it might be a risk factor. And so what we would take this to show really is the complexity of racial identity, and necessarily we're trying to change someone's racial identity, but understand how someone conceptualizes themselves as a racial being within a society, how that just impacts them. And it's good for clinical interventions as well as clinical work to be able to have self-awareness of where you are and how that can impact you, particularly as it relates to substance use. So that is all I have for my talk today. I want to just thank all the graduate students that have worked with me in my lab, the PRISM lab, my collaborators at the University of Georgia through CTAPS, as well as the Adolescent Behavioral Health Research Program here at IU, and then the funding I've had through NIH, as well as the Addictions Grand Challenge at IU. And then here's my presentation.
So thank you very much for that wonderful talk. What we're going to do now is we have about 10 minutes for some questions. If you haven't already, you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat. We'll go ahead and start more or less how they've been received in the order. So someone is asking if you could just give another brief explanation of the crossover effect that you found.
Sure. Yeah. So the crossover effect is that there is a time at which a group is, it's not just specific to African Americans, but where they're at lower risk and then become at higher risk. So the crossover effect for Black Americans is they're generally at lower risk for alcohol use, but it crosses over, particularly in like late 30s to the 50s, where they become at higher risk for alcohol use.
Great. And then another question is, how do you conceptualize racial discrimination in your work? And is there a specific measure that you use, or how would you assess that?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways people have measured racial discrimination. So I think of racism or racial discrimination from that system level. So that there many times we just look at that person-mediated racial discrimination, but there's also studies that look at it at the structural level. So are there like policies in place, as well as just like feeling as though how society views my race. And so I could put in the chat some of the measures I've used for that. There's actually probably 3 or 4 that we use, whether it's kind of the microaggressions or looking more macro level.
So this one actually comes from Laura Longo. She's asking, what types of prevention or intervention efforts do you recommend for professionals who work in universities focusing on the intersections of DEIA and substance use?
Sorry, repeat the question.
So what type of prevention and intervention efforts do you recommend for professionals who work at universities that might be focusing on the intersection between diversity and substance use?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are a lot of things going on, particularly at like NIH and other organizations, where they provide more frameworks or just general understanding of substance use from a DEI perspective. So I know I'm on one for NIAAA that's going to be going on in, I think, next month. So I think some of it's just education, but also then being able to collaborate or work with individuals that are engaging in this work. A lot of the stuff is really understanding not just the factors, but the history behind it. And I think that helps with being able to interpret the findings and being able to understand the implications of them as well. So I know within like different organizations that I worked in, so like RSA has also a diversity committee that's really helpful with thinking about the research. NIDA Clinical Trials has diversity groups that are also helpful with that. And I know NIDA as well.
Okay, so this question is similar to the other one. And then what I think we'll do is we'll give you a chance to maybe reply with a couple of these measure names in the chat while we wait to see if anybody else puts any questions in. But we have a question of what measures might you use to assess microaggressions? So we have racial discrimination and now microaggressions. Do you have thoughts on measures for the latter?
Yeah, and now I'm like blanking on the like formal name of it. But yes, yeah, we have a measure, one that we used in the study that I could put in there. And also I have one, if you're also interested in outside of just race, we have one for heterosexist microaggressions that we've been using as well as one on gender microaggressions. So there's a lot of them out there, and I should have had my tab already up with them listed, but I can put them in the chat, or I can send afterwards the list that I have been using. And I try to use, of course, ones that are validated, have good psychometric properties for the groups that I work with.
Okay, so I was just told that my microphone was making whooshing sounds, so sorry about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and if people want these measures, what we'll do is we'll have Dr. Zapolski, when you have time, email them to me, and then I can be the gatekeeper to send them out so that you're not having to field a bunch of emails. So I'll put my email address in the chat. If you want some of these measures, just please send me a quick email, and we'll give Dr. Zapolski as much time as she needs to collate them, and I'll be sure to forward them on to you. So check out the chat for my email address. We have a few more minutes. If there's time for one more question, I will scroll back up and see one more here. It's a bit of a long question, so I'm going to try my best here. Have you or your collaborators considered applying deviance regulation theory as an intervention to target attitudes about using substances?
I don't think I know the deviance regulation theory, so I have not.
Okay. Maybe that's an interesting one if you want to learn. Maybe you could email Dr. Zapolski directly with that one to talk about it more. But are there any other questions that people have before we wrap up today? And I just saw that Sergey put in the link to our events page, our Twitter feed, as well as our newsletter. You can check those out. There will be 2 more seminar talks, one in the month of March and one in the month of April, where you can join us on webinar. Somebody asked about a recording. Today's session is being recorded. We'll need a few days to clean up the beginning and end of the recording, and it'll be posted on our events page as well. And we'll tweet out a link to that when it's available if you would like to have a record of this. So just on behalf of the Cofrin Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment at KU, I want to thank you, Dr. Zapolski, for taking time today. We would have liked to have you come in person, but obviously ongoing pandemic doesn't permit that. Hopefully we'll get back to in-person sessions for these seminars moving forward. Lots of thank yous in the chat here for you. It was a wonderful presentation. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, and we hope to see you in March and April for our future seminars. Thank you all very much.
If there's people that want to collaborate or want connections, please also email me. I know people in the country that do this. So to go back to the comment about focusing on the work and for professionals at university, just let me know.
Wonderful. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you next month for our next seminar.